I had this girl in my classroom with the ankle monitor on some of the challenges that she is bringing here into school. This is all like stuff going on at home.
Welcome to Mom Mentality, your virtual village of support. I'm Jessica Campbell, your family wellness coach, and I am committed to helping you prioritize your and your family's well-being. This podcast will be like your favorite ladies group chat come to life. We'll share the ups and downs of life for moms just like you, get real advice from coaches and experts, and I'll pop in with my own stories and tips on everyday challenges to the big questions. Whether you're juggling work from home, balancing adult life with parenthood, tackling ADHD, yours or your kids, or just trying to catch a breath, Mom Mentality is your spot.
Okay. So to start off, can you just share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Rodriguez. I am a wife and a mom of two. I have a 5.5-year-old boy and an almost 2.5-year-old girl. I'm bilingual. I speak Spanish as well. My husband is Colombian, and I'm a certified parent coach and happy to be here today.
Love it. Love it. I love the bilingual. That's fun.
Yeah.
I try to speak Spanish, not something that sticks. So I know you mentioned being an educator before. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I started out my professional journey actually being a teacher in Colombia. And I taught children from age 5 up to 3rd grade math and science and English. And that was a really fun job. I learned a lot and observed, all different kinds of families and lifestyles in that school. And then when I came back to the US, I had always worked in education. I was in a variety of different roles. I was a Spanish teacher at one point. So then I taught all the way up through 12th grade. I taught 6th grade through 12th grade-ish. And then I was an administrator in a school at one point, and then I was also in college admissions. So I've really been in a variety of different settings and observed, again, a variety of different families and children and situations, and have a wealth of experiences to share from that as well.
I love that. That's awesome. So I guess being in those roles, how did the observations, I guess, that you had in the classroom, how did that influence your approach that you have now with parenting and coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really began when I was in Colombia and I saw children in my classroom struggling with things that other children weren't. And then when I began to learn more about their families and I also saw their parents interacting with them, I just started getting curious, like, oh, this is at the time I was only 22. So, like I didn't know a lot. I didn't have my own children and it was my first experience out of college. So I just was curious, like, this is really interesting how, how these parents have this lifestyle and maybe aren't ever around and their child turned out like this. And then when I was in the US, I had other experiences similar to that. I worked in a Title IX school, which is a very low income school here in the US. So I had this girl in my classroom with the ankle monitor on, and I just realized, some of the challenges that she is bringing here into school and like her inability to focus in the classroom is not because of any challenge that she has intellectually. This is all like stuff going on at home. And whatever this ankle monitor thing is about, like clearly she made some poor choices, but I truly knew in my heart, like, this is not her fault. This is something that is trauma that has been going on in her life for many years that has led her to the point where she felt like she needed to do that. And I don't know any of the story there, but what that did for me was tell me that the challenges that these children are experiencing started way earlier. And so through that experience as a teacher, and then at the time when I was a teacher of this girl with the ankle monitor situation, I was married and I was experiencing some challenges in my first early years of marriage and experienced a high level, like I didn't know how to handle conflict. And it was a big challenge for me to communicate well. And I tended to be more negative than I wanted to be. And when I started going to therapy with my husband, I just started learning so much more about myself and about my own upbringing and how so much of that impacted who I was through my attachment systems, my nervous system, just communication patterns and things like that. And so after that experience, I just knew I have to do something different in my own family. I can't raise another child that turns out with some of these major challenges that I'm dealing with right now. And I didn't know how to do that. So I started looking around and stumbled upon Janet Lansbury. She had this approach called the respectful infant educating approach. And she just sounded like an angel. I was like, who is this woman and how is she talking like that? And she just modeled a different way to be as a human and as a parent. And I wanted so badly to be like her. But kind of like you said at the beginning with learning Spanish, learning to speak the way that she was speaking was like a foreign language. I felt like this is so disingenuous. This is not me. How can I, have these words come out of my mouth in a way that feels more natural? And so through all of those experiences and then becoming a mom myself at around that same time, wanting to do things so differently for my own son, but not really knowing how to do that, I just dove headfirst into childhood development. I listened to hundreds of hours of podcasts and I read a lot of books and I really became obsessed is really the term I would use. But at the same time, I was like, oh my God, this is mind blowing. And people have to know this information. How can you be a parent and not know this stuff? Like,
Right.
yeah, it just blew my mind. And I wanted to share everything that I was learning with everyone around me. And so I'll let you ask the next question. But I think just to bring it back, that is really the teaching and being a teacher and what I saw in my classroom in all these different settings really taught me that parents is where it starts. Like we're the foundation of shifting the narrative or shifting the pattern or shifting the relationship or the mental health of our children. And so I really wanted to work moving forward. I really wanted to work with parents. I didn't want to be a teacher anymore because I wanted to get in front of the problems before they started.
Right. I totally resonate with that. That's very similar to where I was, but mine was more like just the dysregulation and the yelling and like I was like, okay, I know these things, but it's not, I guess not, it's not necessarily working, or it wasn't my go-to to say these certain scripts that I was finding. And I dove into the mindset stuff like, well, if I can fix my mindset, maybe this will be better, which I mean, totally changed my life, but not in the way I thought it would. And so, like, once I got into understanding the child development and understanding like the patterns that were coming from just, I mean, I have a very long back line of family trauma, and the patterns in my family just dating back are very deep rooted and very dysfunctional. And when I was able to start connecting those dots, that's when things started to evolve for me. But even going through coaching, I was like, how am I going to coach other people if I can't get it together? But it took that time, to really get it to integrate. And just like the Spanish thing, like I can remember some Spanish words, but it's not something that's been active enough in my life that I've been able to integrate it wholly. I know some, but not, it's not something that just comes automatically to me. But as I've been going through just life with my kids, it starts to form that new pattern. But wanting something different for my kids, knowing where I came from and what I didn't want for them, and then seeing,
Mhm.
even with me doing things differently, seeing the pattern still showing up. Because as different as I wasn't hitting my kids. That was a huge thing, that I didn't have growing up. And so I'm like, okay, I'm doing things totally different, but yet there's still similar outcomes. What's going on? I think
Yeah.
it's something we don't shed enough light on, because I think so many of us as parents want to think that we know what we're doing. And so it's like we shame ourselves into thinking if we ask for help or we look for that and then it doesn't come out perfect, like there's something wrong and we don't want to say it. And so it just becomes this like, it's almost like we get more defensive, like when someone else wants to help, we get more defensive because we're like, this should be different.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I can absolutely relate to that as well.
You mentioned Janet Lansbury. How did that approach, I guess, resonate with you? I know you said she seemed like an angel in the way she was going, but
Yeah.
what specifically about that, piqued your interest and helped you kind of shift your direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember thinking about how she talked to babies and how she treated little babies as respectfully as she would an adult. So like when you're changing their diapers, she would say, "Okay, now I'm going to lay you down and I'm going to open your diaper and it might be cold and it'll be over really soon." And she just like had this way of speaking that was like explaining everything to the little baby as if the baby understood everything that she was saying. And I think in my mind, I was always like, well, babies don't understand your words, or like they're just going to forget about it later. So, like, I remember growing up and there was a girl from a family that I knew that was adopted and she had been in an orphanage. And I just could not understand why, as a teenager, she was struggling with all of these different things that were related to like her being in an orphanage. It was like kids don't remember that stuff, but they don't consciously remember it, but it's like it's ingrained into their body. And our body, like the book, The Body Keeps the Score, our body truly does keep the score of what happened to us, even when we were infants. And so it was really fascinating to me how she just had this way of explaining everything to little babies and saying like, okay, I'm going to pick you up now. And now I'm going to put your arm through this shirt and I'm going to put your leg in. Oh, I know that's cold. You don't like that. And maybe the baby's crying but the mother and the way that she was speaking was just so calm and unaffected by the baby's cries and just understanding of what the baby was experiencing. And I don't know. I just thought I have to be like her. I don't know how she's doing that, but it just sounded so beautiful and so connected. And she has, many podcasts from that speak about infant educating, but also a lot about toddlers. And I can't remember anything specifically that she said off the top of my head right now, other than just treating children as respectable and lovable little beings that are equally as important as I am as the adult, that I don't have to use my power to control them to get them to do what I want them to do. She presented this whole way that was not about manipulating children or using punishments or rewards or demands or shame or guilt. And she just provided a whole new language that maybe I had heard, but consciously I don't remember. And so, yeah, I wanted to memorize every word that came out of her mouth and be just like her. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And isn't it funny how we do just want to, we're like, if we can just memorize it, like when the reality is like you said, it's so ingrained in our body. We have to do that work too. And it is such a holistic way of reparenting yourself and then also parenting your kids. But
Yeah.
I know for myself, I'm still one of those people that wants to know the why of everything. And maybe that's my ADHD. I don't know. But like, so when my kids ask why, more often than not, I definitely try to explain. I'm like, sometimes I'm like, I just don't have the answer. I don't know. Let's look it up or, whatever. But so like one of the things that always drove me crazy is like the whole because I said so thing. And like, I've explained to my kids that sometimes I don't have an answer, and so sometimes there is a because I said so because of a safety thing. But even then, usually I can say, okay, safety, like that's not safe. I don't have more details than that for you, but I can tell you I know this. And so the majority of the time I could tell you when I don't want to explain something is because I'm distracted and I just don't want to take the energy to do it. And I think that happens more often than we like to admit. But because I think looking back at the history of the because I said so, it's more just like, I don't want to take the time to do this. And I can imagine with those babies being talked to, they may not understand the words, but because you're just engaging with them, like it's building that connection, but they don't know it. But it's like, there's like that, oh, what is it? That there's like a study where they did like the still face. I can't remember what they called it, where you like, yeah. So like if you're just changing their diaper and you're not, and they're upset and you're just like, like, they're not feeling that connection. But even just talking or like singing to them or just something that makes them feel like you're acknowledging what they're trying to tell you, I imagine that's really where the connection comes from. And it's not so much about what she's telling them so much as how she's telling them.
Yeah, it's the energy. Yeah. I don't remember who said it, but somebody said children, especially age 3 and under, feel our energy much more than they actually hear our words. Feel our energy, hear our, like, understand our tone, however you want to phrase it.
Right.
And it's so true. They don't often know the words that are coming out of our mouths. But even if you, I don't know, went to Japan or like Russia or like some other country and you inserted yourself there and you were just listening to what people were talking about, you can absolutely tell if someone is angry or if they're happy. And you can still feel like if you're in a room with two people that are fighting in a foreign language, doesn't matter that you don't understand what they're saying, you can still feel the anger
Right. The
out
tension.
of them, right?
Yeah. Well, and there's like body language and there's tone, and you can hear a tone even if you can't tell what the person's saying. And like you said, the energy, like that whole thing just like wraps up into that. And, I used to get so triggered because my mom would say that. And my mom was not a healthy person in my life. And she used to say when my oldest was little, like, oh, you need to calm down because she can feel it. And I get so mad because I'm like, you're irritating me and you're going to sit there and tell me I need to be calm because she can feel it. Like your life can't be bad. You can't complain about things because she's going to feel it. When the reality was half the time I was triggered by her. And then she'd say that to me and then tell me to breathe. And I get so worked up. And so I think we also need to put out that disclaimer too, that just because you have anxiety or whatever doesn't mean that you can't still like build that healthy connection. But when you can acknowledge it or pass off the baby when you're having a moment, or like sometimes you just have anxiety in your body and that's okay. But if you can calmly like regulate through the anxiety, it's not about the fact that you have that energy there, but it's about the fact that you're able to regulate in a way that the energy you're putting off to everyone else isn't the same. Like I used to get really bothered by that because I was like, I'm messing up my kid just by being anxious. Like I can't help that I'm anxious. And so
Yeah.
I definitely think that's worth saying.
Yeah.
What are some of the real life challenges that you dealt with through like, well, even up until now, your kids are still young. So toddler years, baby years, all of the years. What are some of the challenges that you've dealt with and how do you maintain your values when things are like hard?
That's a beautiful question. I have struggled a lot with my older one, my son. Ever since he was probably 8 months old, he was very aggressive. He would often, whenever he was angry, instead of like throwing himself on the floor and kicking his feet on the ground and kind of wailing, having a tantrum, he would hit or he would bite or scratch, or then it became kicking or screaming or saying mean words. And he has always been a bit of a challenge. He's got a lot of energy. When he was 2.5 months old, he could scoot across the floor like an inchworm on his back. He would just like, he had a bald spot on the back of his head from how much he would scoot on the floor. So he always had a lot of energy. And, I think I always chalked those behaviors up to like, oh, he's a boy. Oh, he's little. He's supposed to have this much energy. Like he doesn't have impulse control yet. It's not developed. And regardless of those things, it was still hard.
Mhm.
And, it became harder. I think, from the beginning, I alluded to like I was obsessed with childhood development. I really loved this respectful infant educating approach. And so I initially had a very easy time calming his tantrums or like if he'd hit, just gently holding his hands back. But sometimes he would bite me or scratch me and I really couldn't prevent it. And those times it was pretty triggering for me. And I don't know exactly why that is. I still to this day haven't really been able to make sense of like when I get physically hurt, why that's so triggering to me. But it was initially really, really hard. And so it only became harder the bigger he got and the smarter he got. And so he was about 3 years old when I think things got to probably the worst point in our relationship between him and me, because most of the time the aggression was directed at me and not my husband. Maybe that's because I reacted to it more. I was affected by it more than my husband was. But in any case, he also maybe knew that I was pregnant and, there was a little baby that was on the way. And so that was really hard, really, really hard. He got, as bigger and I would hold his hands back and then he'd start kicking. And so everything just had begun to increase in frequency and intensity. And then when my daughter was born, even though he adored her, oh my gosh, when we walked in the door from being in the hospital, not having seen him at all for 2 days, we walked in the door with his baby sister. He didn't even say hello to us. He just wanted to see her. And the pictures I have, I still have them just like stamped into my memory. they're the most beautiful, sweet, like I did not expect him to react like that at all when seeing this little baby girl, but he was incredible with her. And he absolutely has a, love slash, I wouldn't call it hate, but jealous relationship with her, as I think do all siblings, which makes sense. But when she was like 5 months old, things got even worse. And I started acting in a way that I really didn't want to and that didn't align with my values. So I think what I suppose I wanted to share was that I struggled with postpartum anxiety and I didn't know it until my daughter was about 5 months old. And the way that it presented for me was an anger and irritability, not so much an anxiety, but that's like the category that they kind of
Right.
put you in. And so again, I didn't know it. And I started exploding more on my son when he was aggressive with my little innocent 5-month-old baby, because no longer was the anger and the aggression directed at me. It was now more frequently being directed at her.
Right.
And
That
so
protective, like mama bear.
Mama
Like,
Bear, yeah, she was right there coming out and wanting to protect her little one. And so that was really, gosh, it was the hardest thing I've ever had to witness. And it still is. I mean, literally earlier today, he pushed my daughter over. And that happens more frequently when he's sick because any, glimpse of impulse control that he did have at age 5.5 is literally offline when he's
right.
sick. So if you have a child who's sick and you're experiencing that too, just know like that happens. It's normal. It's normal for that to occur and just to be a little bit more on high alert when your children are not feeling so well.
Right.
So anyway, for me, the postpartum period became one of the most overwhelming points in my life. And I did go on an anxiety medicine. I went on Zoloft. And so I I just want other moms to know like it's okay to get help if you need it and you're seeing that or maybe you don't even know that your irritability and your anger is actually postpartum anxiety. Maybe look into that more because honestly, a test on the internet gave me way more information about what I was experiencing than the stupid, like 5-question test at the doctor's office.
Right.
And I was frustrated about that because, that's a whole other topic, but our healthcare system, I felt like didn't give me the information that I needed to be a successful mother with
Right.
these two kids. And
You have to advocate for yourself 100%. Like, when something's wrong and you have to trust your gut too, because
yeah,
especially, every doctor is different too. So if you know that there's something wrong, like do the research because I too struggled and I'm not super far removed from that either because my daughter's 19 months old and she's the first child I've had that I've been working from home and I was that same way. I was triggered so easily. I would just yell all the time and I was like in the midst of my coaching training while this stuff was going on and I was like what is happening, like I know all of these things, I understand, but I'm still so beyond. And I had to get put, I was on Zoloft also. I am now actually on ADHD medication which I had never been in my life and that significantly changed. And I brought that up because I was like, I think part of the reason I've been put on so many different antidepressants through my life and I end up with a side effect or it stops working. And now that they've put me on that, I feel like I'm able to like kind of get my life back. But I dealt with postpartum something with every one of my children. I have 3 and it progressively had gotten worse and the anxiety was always there. But with my last, it was so much rage. And I do think it's just because I had so many things on my plate too, that it kind of like illuminated that already aggressive behavior in me that then it just made it that much worse because I was trying to like juggle all the balls. So I
yeah.
totally get that.
Yeah. Yeah, it sucks. It's really hard. And especially as a parent coach, I felt an intense imposter syndrome. I was like, who am I to be acting in ways that I'm really not proud of and that don't feel good to me and that are not in alignment with my values? And, having these 2 young kids. And so when my mood was finally stabilized after taking Zoloft, it really helped significantly. And I'm so grateful that I got that help because my relationship with my son had really started to decline. And I that's the last thing that I wanted. My goal has always been that my children feel unconditionally loved and that they truly feel that way, not just hear that from me.
Right.
And that's why I named my coaching practice Unconditional Connections, because that is my number one goal. And, I kept trying to set also these like firm, loving limits with my son, but I would also be asking myself too, like, why is my son aggressive on almost a daily basis? Why is this happening? And why is it that I'm able to work with these parents in my coaching practice and they get such great results after working with me, but I don't? And why can't I figure out my own son? Right?
Right.
Because it's one thing to talk about me and my reactions, and I've really had to learn how to work with that and calm my own nervous system and find, support for myself. But, in that moment, I think it would have been easy, speaking from coach to coach, it would be easy for me to have gone down this route of like, yes, I feel this imposter syndrome, so I'm just going to give up. Like, who am I? I
Right.
shouldn't be doing this.
Mhm.
But then I really began to lean in on these reviews that my clients had left me. And I knew I was making a huge difference. I knew I was supporting families and doing what I loved, even if I was struggling at home.
Mhm.
So I kept coaching parents, but at the same time, I also kept searching for answers because I was like, something is different here. And I don't know what it is, but, something's going on. Like, otherwise, my approach and all of these tools that I have as a parent coach would be more supportive and effective for my own son.
Right.
And my husband saw the same struggles that I did, but neither one of us really understood why your son kept going into these aggressive episodes and why they were now like at this point in time when my daughter was about 5 months old, like almost on a daily basis.
Mhm.
And so I kept on thinking that all of this was normal. He doesn't have impulse control. He's a boy. He's got a lot of energy. But it wasn't until this past summer when I really realized when we were on a family vacation that this is not normal. And at the time, so now my daughter is 2 years old, fast forward. And I think part of that was having a second child to compare my first one to. And not that I don't ever recommend you compare one child to another, but
Right.
for me, it was helpful to just be able to understand that it could be different and that it wasn't necessarily my parenting
Right.
because my child was so different, right?
Mhm.
It really opened my eyes and actually encouraged me to get help. And I think that if I hadn't had that second child, then I wouldn't be where I am.
Right.
And so not only did I have this son who was aggressive and like on the family vacation, like zero impulse control. Like I truly thought we were going to be paying thousands of dollars in damage to the Airbnb that we were renting because of how bad it had gotten. And I could not for the life of me, Jessica, figure out how do I calm this child down? Like he's clearly dysregulated. He's clearly, angry, activated, aggressive, whatever you want to call it. He's clearly dysregulated. Now, what do I do to help him? Because telling him to take deep breaths, he will absolutely just like run away from me. Like he's just
Oh, I used to hate that.
won't
Take a
do
deep
it.
breath. I was like, I don't want a breath. Yeah. Like, what do you
Yeah.
do when they won't accept
Yep.
it?
Exactly. Exactly. And everybody's telling you, oh, you got to get him to take deep breath. Okay, whatever. Try a rainbow breath. Try a hot cocoa breath. Smell the hot
Yes.
cocoa and then blow it out because it's too hot. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
This kid would not respond to that. And so I I knew at that point I needed help. And I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't do it anymore on my own. I needed someone else to like take a look at him.
Right.
And so at that point, like from a mental health perspective, I felt like I had hit rock bottom. Like it hurt so bad as a mother to be observing my child struggle so much, to see it impacting my marriage and to see it impacting my daughter so badly. And her getting feeling the brunt of everything that my son was going through was just not fair and just unhealthy for her. And I know that someday I'm going to have to support her in overcoming some of the the aggression that she's endured as a
Right.
child. And that hurts very deeply. And I wish that I knew then what I know now, because I'm pretty certain that it would have helped me decrease the aggressive episodes with my son. And so as I started looking for help, I began looking into something called sensory processing disorder because I was thinking that was related to my son's avoidance of loud noises and his previous love of balloons that turned into a hate of balloons, his extreme fear of like them popping, like not even going into a birthday party because there's balloons around. He walked on his toes. He started becoming more avoidant of different foods and just this extreme amount of energy. I was like, is this ADHD? Is this sensory processing? I don't know, but like something is going on here. And so then I also had him evaluated by this organization in Colorado called Child Find that tests kids' readiness for like basically school accommodations. So it's more geared toward, I think, ADHD and autism, but he scored off the charts. I mean, academically, intellectually, the kid has no challenges. My son he's very bright, which also comes with its own set of challenges.
Right.
So anyway, that was great confirmation, but they also told me, well, he doesn't need any accommodations. So at the time, I didn't really know it was just about school accommodations. I thought it was going to give me some more insight into like neurologically what was happening. So anyway, finally, after hours on the phone with insurance and scouring the internet and filling out paperwork, I took my son to occupational therapy. And he had been in some play therapy before, which helped a little bit, I would say, but it just logistically was very inconvenient for my family. And so we wanted to test out OT because of the other sensory things that I just mentioned. And the first thing after I filled out the paperwork and went to the appointment that the OT said to me was, I think this is PDA, which stands for pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent demand avoidance. And I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, I don't see my son demanding to have more autonomy or avoiding doing what I'm asking all the time. I don't know that that's what this is. But then I went home. I was curious, I was curious to know why she perceived that. Like, what was it that I marked on the assessment that made her think that? Because it was really based on what I told her, not anything that she observed in my son. But I went home and I felt like I had this new set of detective lenses. And so I started looking for all the times that my son was having a meltdown or getting aggressive and just thinking, what happened right before that? And was it because of a loss of autonomy or was it because I had demanded something? And in fact, I noticed that it was. And the OT recommended I look into this woman's work. Her name is Casey Elrich, and she has an organization or a coaching practice called At Peace Parents. And then I also took some other PDA assessments online, and I didn't really feel like after taking the assessments that my son really aligned with this PDA thing. But then when I found her PDF on the 5 characteristics of a PDA child, I thought, wow, this sounds exactly like my son. And he had 4 of the 5 characteristics. And so, you know, being able to understand that for me was huge. And I'm happy to share those 5 characteristics with your listeners if you want and to
Absolutely.
explain a little bit more what PDA is.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, if you have any resources, we'll definitely put them in the show notes too for anyone who might be struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what PDA is, again, it could stand for pathological demand avoidance. I just personally don't like to use that word. I think it is disrespectful, but I prefer to use either pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent demand avoidance. And in summary, what this is, in the simplest way possible, if you could just think about a time when you had a panic attack or you were in a car crash or walking down a dark street at night or were intensely afraid, you can kind of link back to those feelings of fear that come up for you. And maybe you wanted to fight back. Maybe it was a flight response. You wanted to run away, or maybe you froze in the face of that fear. And what PDA is very similar to that feeling, except they feel that same level of fear or nervous system activation going into fight, flight, freeze as if they were going to die when they perceive a loss of autonomy or a loss of equality with you or their teacher or someone around them. And so the challenge is that most kids with this nervous system sensitivity are high masking, meaning when they go into public or they're at school, they will hide their fear or they hide that nervous system activation when they do have that perceived loss of autonomy or equality. And what happens is that fear then comes out at home in what's called equalizing behavior, or over time, this fear begins to accumulate. So one of the primary characteristics of PDA is that it's an accumulation. The effect of it is cumulative. So if over time a child experiences more and more and more and more and more loss of autonomy, it's as if they have a cup of water and you keep adding more into it. You're pouring more and more and more into it, and then eventually it just starts overflowing. And so with a child like my son, who maybe initially was okay and those aggressive episodes weren't happening as often, and then started to happen more on a daily basis, that's what was going on for him. He was in burnout. The accumulation had grown to be too much, so that even the slightest loss of autonomy or loss of equality would send him overflowing into fight, flight, and freeze more frequently.
Right. Like what's seemingly minimal for him was not minimal because he was already at that threshold.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, I do want to clear up, like nobody likes to be told what to do. That's
Right.
absolutely true. But the key difference here is that these children are especially sensitive to these demands or loss of autonomy, and they will perceive most limits as like something they will die fighting against because their
Right.
nervous system is tricking them into believing that they're not equally as important or valued as we are.
Right.
And so for these really beautiful, sensitive children, a firm, even loving limit and direct language might actually push them over the deep end so far that they go from that 0 to 10, 0 to 1,000 in a millisecond, and they get
Right.
super angry. And, my son has broken plates before. It's been really intense.
Right.
And kids will do just about anything to get their autonomy back. So they'll say harsh
Wonder
words.
how older kids deal with that and didn't know that they deal with that. I actually work in special education. I work virtually because I didn't want to be in an aggressive place and I wanted to be home with my kids. But this is my first time being in education, and we have a lot of behavior kids. And it's not necessary, like some of them need a little bit of like math, comprehension help or things like that. But like we have a lot more children with behavior. And as they get older, it just makes me wonder how many older kids or how many just adults have gone through that and not had this kind of information.
Yeah.
It's
I don't
interesting.
know. I think it's gone so missed. And part of that is, nobody's fault. PDA isn't actually even a diagnosis
Mm,
in the US yet. And so no wonder people aren't really talking about it. It's
right.
official over in Europe, but it's not here in the US. And so
Go figure.
yeah, it's
I
no
said
one.
go
Yeah.
figure. I have an
Yeah, go
issue with
figure.
the US.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but anyway, so I just want people to know, like if you start seeing your kid being avoidant to demands or autonomy, and you see that they're starting to do anything to get their autonomy back, like they're saying really harsh words, they're picking on the weakest person in the family, even if they had nothing to do with whatever limit it was that you just set. For example, my son one time threw pretzels all over the floor that he just told me that he wanted to eat. Or one time I told him that he needed to go wash his hands and he didn't want to, so he walked over to his little sister and just pushed her over. He has thrown his toys to the point of almost breaking them. He'll scream, he'll do anything to
Right.
get that autonomy back. And what that's called is called equalizing behavior. So if he perceives that he is less than, he's not equal to me, then he will try to bring himself back up into equality by making me feel as bad as he feels,
Oh, yeah.
by making himself feel more powerful somehow.
Yeah.
And that
That's
is
interesting that you say that because it's making me think. So like you were saying, even the loving limits can set them over the edge. But
exactly.
is that something that you found, like, they say to get down on their level and things like that? Have you found that those kinds of things do help more? Or what does that look like with you now? Like when you have that interaction
Mhm.
with him, how does that show up now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was hoping that you would ask me because, I think your listeners or even have heard what my parenting approach has been from the beginning. And I wanted to say, if I hadn't stumbled across Janet Lansbury, if I hadn't become a parent coach, if I didn't have all of these skills, and if I hadn't responded to my child with empathy and connection and conscious or compassionate communication and loving limits or seeking to really understand his behavior, and rather had approached him initially with punishments or rewards or manipulation of some kind, like, I truly think my son's burnout could have gotten so bad that it would have gone way beyond just physical aggression. And you do see this in other PDA kids. Casey Elrich, who I mentioned at the beginning with this resource, experienced that with her own son. He actually would not eat because that was the only way that he could put himself back into equality.
Right.
And so some kids do that. Some kids don't use the potty. Some kids don't sleep. And so I think just being aware of that is really important.
They might end up with an ankle monitor, right? Who knows? It could be a situation where they're like, if I can't do it here, I'm going to do it out there. And then Lord knows what could happen. Yeah, that's a scary thought.
Yeah. So to be clear, I still believe in setting firm, loving limits. I just think that for these particular types of children, you need a different language to speak to them. And so I think you have to notice that demands can come out in a variety of different ways, and direct language can be triggering to these kinds of kids. So, instead of saying something like that might seem, very simple and not unkind in any way, you might say like, okay, go put your shoes on. It's time to go. With a kid like that, they're going to perceive that as a threat. Go put your shoes on. They're being told what to do. Right.
They're like, I'm burning the house down. That's it. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, and it's like subjective. Yeah. Like you could remove yourself from it and giggle about it, but it's really not funny in the situation. But, we all look back at kids' stories of kids throwing a tantrum, and as adults, we're like, okay, that's ridiculous. But it's not to them. It's not.
Right. And your kid's reaction to that is going to depend on how full their tolerance cup is too, right? So if they're in the burnout stage, just saying that could send them into a complete meltdown. But if they're not, maybe, they'll feel that the impact of those words, but it won't come out in a tantrum or aggressive behavior. It just depends. But anyway, so for a child like my son, that might be very triggering. And a very easy way to get around that is to say, we're leaving in 5 minutes, your shoes are by the door.
Oh, yeah.
So it's called declarative language. It's making observations or making statements or asking questions like, I wonder what you might need to do. So another way to say this would be, we're leaving in 5 minutes. I wonder what you might need to do before we get out the door. Or you could be more specific. I wonder what you need on your feet before we have to leave.
I have to do that with my oldest because she has ADHD. I'll be like, are you missing something? And she has no shoes on. And she's ready to walk out the door. I'm like, girlfriend, I think something's missing. And then she's like, oh.
Yeah. And so, it's hard speaking this new language is even one step beyond what I've already shifted. It's like, I was learning French 1.0 and then I mastered that. And now I'm at French 2.0 and I'm like, all right, here we go again. So I'm constantly catching myself, and it's not something I'm ever perfect at. And I hope anyone out there doesn't think you ever have to be perfect at this. You can always catch yourself and be like, oops, actually what I meant to say was, and change what you said. All that said, there are times where I set very firm limits, like my kids are playing in the same room. My daughter grabs a magnetile, that my son's playing with. He goes and to raise his hand is going to hit her. I've still got to block his hand, and I still have to say, no, I won't let you do that. But then from there, he might scream back, oh, but she took my magnetile and it's not fair. And he's like level 100,000 angry at her just for grabbing a little magnetile. Right. But for him, that threat and that feeling of that loss of autonomy or equality is so huge that it results in a bigger explosion than, most people would experience. Right. And so, you can work with children like this and let them know that you're going to be there to keep both children safe. And part of that means that I can't let you equalize, quote unquote, make your sister feel as bad as you feel right now that she took your magnetile. So I put my body physically in between them and I block the hit. I might say very few words like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And then once I've let him, say whatever he says. It's, yeah, I know. I'm so sorry she did that. I know that's not fair that she took that from you. But then I ask him something like, instead of telling him what to do, I'll ask him something like, how can you get the peace back from her without using your body to solve your problem?
Right. Which
And
just
usually,
contributes to helping them build that resilience for as they get older.
Mhm.
Because I mean, so often, especially in like this space of like the switch of generational types of parenting, there's so often like, well, in the real world, but at the end of the day, they're a child. They're not in the real world yet. And by allowing them to have that space and process it now, we're helping them learn that when their brain is more developed and they can understand, okay, maybe this is how I can handle it, they will get to that point. But right now,
Yeah.
they're not in the real world, and there's a reason they live with us for so long, and we
Right.
help guide them.
Yeah.
It's
And
such
I
a
think it's,
good.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as this. It's a skill deficit. He doesn't know how to calm himself down, and his nervous system is way too sensitive for me to expect him to not hit when he does feel that, when he does feel threatened like that. And
Right,
so it's my job to come in and set the limit and guide him, like you said, to coach him to solve his problems without using his body. And he's old enough that he knows, and I've asked him this question enough that he knows what to do. And I also think it's important to mention that our kids know what's right and what's wrong. They know it's not okay to hit. They know it's not okay to, to grab or kick or scream or whatever in their sibling's face, but they can't stop themselves in that moment. So I have to do that for him.
right,
And so when I offer him empathy of like, oh, yeah, that really sucks. She took that from you and that's not fair. That's hard and you really wanted that or whatever it is that I'm saying, that helps him to what's called close his lid, have access to his upstairs brain and not be living from the fight, flight, freeze downstairs brain.
right.
And it allows him to think about how can I solve this problem without using my fist. And
One of
so,
the things that we like to call that is the barking dog and the wise owl from I
yes.
think it's Dr. Becky.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, so we'll say you got to bring your owl back.
Yeah.
My kids
Yeah.
love that analogy because we try to talk with them about it. I think this is like just such a beautiful example of how we really all have to find our own path and our own way with our own family because all of us is so unique. And I think
Mhm.
there's such a misconception, especially in the realm of the work that we do also as coaches, that we have it all together because we don't. And we have specific needs and our kids have specific needs. And yeah, I think that this conversation definitely was different than I thought it was going to be. But I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because I feel like it's kind of like given me some light bulbs. We actually just got done with OT for my oldest and we did a sensory checklist I found online and find that my older two are on opposite ends. My
Mhm.
oldest is like no socks. She won't wear jeans. She won't eat certain foods. And then my middle is like she went to all the OT stuff, and then the lady there like let her do stuff too because she was like just like kind of chomping at the bit, like you're playing with slime. I need to play with it. And so she'd be like, okay. And so it's so interesting. But even hearing you say like the way that you speak, not that my middle is like at that level, but I could see how sometimes when she is in that mood of like where she needs that autonomy a little more, or where she feels like she's on the back burner a little bit. Cause, as a middle child, sometimes that happens anyway. I could see where shifting some of that language could definitely be beneficial in my household.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. That is a challenge in your family. And it sounds like you've got a lot of extra things to be thinking about with your kiddos.
Yeah. We've done some of those like push pull, like wall things. When I notice she's
Mhm.
getting too aggressive, like she loves putting that energy out. And so I've talked with her about like sometimes you got to get it out of your body. And so I'll get her to like push on the wall as hard. I'm like, get it as hard as you
Yeah.
can. Or I'll tell her like I'll get her to push on my hands because sometimes she likes that. Or we'll play like the little hand game where you like hover your hand above each other and you try to like smack the top of their hands. And it just helps her get excited and get that energy out in a more like fun way. But it's definitely she could definitely be more aggressive. So while it's not on the same scale, I definitely resonated with some of the things that you said because I was like, sounds like my child.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's more kiddos out there that are struggling with this than we even realize, right? And
No,
it's
yeah,
a spectrum, it's going to present in different ways for different families, but ultimately I think the best part about this is that the language shift is something anybody can do.
Mhm.
And it has helped me tremendously. I mean, first of all, it was taking off my old lenses and putting on different lenses and just recognizing that this is a struggle for my child and not to worry about what anybody else says or thinks or, yeah, whatever, any judgment from any outsiders. It's about this is my child and this is what he's struggling with. And even though he's 5.5, like maybe he should, quote unquote, have more, ability to behave differently with his little sister and more impulse control, whatever. He doesn't. And that's not where we're at. And when I accept him for who he is and where we're at as a family, and when my husband and I have gotten onto the same page about this,
Yeah.
the
Yes.
amount of stress in our family has significantly decreased. And I will have you know that the aggressive episodes have decreased as well.
Oh, I love
And
that.
so it's just been, it was a rough journey, but finding those answers really changed my life.
That's amazing. I love that. I love hearing that, like, full circle. And to be honest, I also love hearing another coach struggle. Like,
Mhm.
and that's part of why had started this podcast was just because I want that transparency of like, we don't all have it together, especially as moms, because I think we have such high standards for ourselves. And then to be
Yeah.
able to say, as a coach, I'm also struggling. So it's not just like from a mom perspective, it's that imposter syndrome, like you said, of being a coach and wanting to help other people, but then feeling like if you can't do it, how are you going to help
Mhm.
them do it? And like I said, I think it's just such a beautiful example of how we literally all have to create our own map and figure out what works for us and for our kids and
Yeah.
not compare it to other people. And like you said, like comparing it to your other kids, yeah, it can be a little bit of a guiding light on like, okay, maybe I should check this out. It doesn't need to be like
Mhm.
there's something wrong with you and not with your
Mhm.
sibling.
Right.
It's just that they all have different needs and how can
Mhm.
we show up the best way we can to
Yes.
be there for those needs and help guide them through those needs. I'm really interested to see how my youngest is because
Mhm.
it has a hot temper and
Mhm.
she's kind of like that where she hits me already and she's just like she'll just look at me and smack me across the face and I'm like my oldest
Mhm.
actually did that, not hard the other day, but she was like panicking about, oh, she got her tooth knocked. Like they were play wrestling with their dad and he, I guess, kneed her or something. They
Oh
don't really
no.
know exactly what happened, but it knocked one of her teeth out, like almost completely out. It was like dangling. And as I was trying to like work her through it to like calm her down, she just looked at me and just smacked me. And she didn't hit me hard. So I looked at her and I said, I'll accept that right now. I was like, but after we got done, I was like, you are not allowed to smack me in the face just
Mhm.
because but it was like I could see in her face that she didn't know what else to do. And it was like this
Uh-huh.
reflex of like, I don't know. And like
Uh-huh.
I mean, she barely even did it, but then she giggled a little bit. And so when we were done and we had to have that conversation of like, I know you didn't know what to do with your body at that point because you had all this energy, but that's not acceptable. So next time we're not
Mhm.
doing that. But they all have such different personalities and needs. And, I also think speaking to just having a label, sometimes I tend to get judgment. It's not directed at me, but I hear a lot of conversations around like everyone wants a label or people are just saying every kid has ADHD. My daughter and I got diagnosed a week apart and I
Mhm.
had been self-diagnosed for years because I just knew it. And I had a couple of like therapists tell me that I probably had it, but then didn't do anything about it. And so when that finally came up, it was just so relieving to understand how things work. And so I think while you don't necessarily have to push for a diagnosis, it is also very freeing to understand your child a little bit more if that is the situation that's happening, because it kind of validates that feeling of like something is not normal here. And I
Yes,
mean,
that's exactly how I felt.
realistically like what is normal, but like there's a certain level of like what is baseline, and when you know that
Mhm.
there's something off, having that moment of like no, there definitely is so validating. I think
Mhm.
we definitely need to remove some of the stigma around having these labels, because even though like sometimes my husband's like, maybe everyone's on the spectrum. I'm like, they could be. He's like, maybe we're just all on one giant spectrum and just some of us like show it more
Yeah.
than others. I'm like, it all could be, but just knowing that we all have our things and then being able to hear that, you're not crazy essentially, because
Yeah.
sometimes that's how we feel is like, I must be nuts because this isn't right or this isn't working or, it looks different than what, again, it should. I hate saying should because I'm like, nothing should,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
should is like the worst thing I think we can do to ourselves, but it is an interesting thing. This conversation is kind of like blown my mind a little bit. It's something I'm going to probably be researching and thinking on
Mhm.
quite a bit. So, wrapping this up, because I know I want to honor your time. If there is somebody else who is struggling with similar things, if you could give them one piece of advice, what would you say? Where should they start if they want to either figure out if they maybe have their child is struggling with the same stuff, or if they need to help? Where would you say to start if someone is struggling like you were back then? Or what would you say to yourself back then?
Yeah. Well, I can't underestimate the power of understanding my child. Just like you said, it's to me, it's not even about the label because, again, PDA isn't even a diagnosis in the US. So I don't even know 100% if that's truly, truly what this is. What I do know is that seeing my son's behavior through this lens and approaching him with the type of language and other lifestyle modifications that we've made has been enormously helpful for a relationship. I honestly think that if you have a child who's struggling like this, is neurodivergent in some way, that parents need support just as much as children do. And if you're a parent, I honestly think the best place to go is to see a parent coach. I truly don't have any other best advice for you because one, most people aren't even PDA affirming. Jessica, one of the things you can put in the show notes is link to the Society PDA affirming providers in the United States so that people
Okay.
can look for ones in their state or in their city
Yeah.
because that is really important. But even if your provider doesn't understand, like if you can go to them and present them with the information that I can also send you and to put in the show notes about PDA and say, I think this is what this is, is this what you observe as well? Then that will be enormously helpful. And you can, work with someone who's at least open to exploring what PDA is.
Right.
But I would say, if your child has frequent aggressive episodes, maybe they're fine at school or in public, but at home is having these really explosive or like really frequently shuts down. Maybe they act like their legs don't work. Maybe they refuse to eat or use the potty. Maybe they're constantly needing your attention, like they won't play on their own. They're resisting demands, then you might have a PDA child on your hands, and it's really important to get support. Now, it depends on what kind of PDA child it is, what kind of support they're going to need. We actually ended up pulling my son out of OT, and now he's in play therapy because the way that his PDA presents, and I think more children's PDA than not presents as like this nervous system anxiety piece. And so play therapy is better suited for that. And we have told his play therapist, even though she wasn't necessarily PDA affirming, all the information that we know about PDA so that she can approach my son with those techniques or like that language in mind. But if you've been using rewards or punishments or things, you might need some supports in other areas, or there are
Right.
other comorbidities, meaning like PDA could be coupled with sensory processing disorder, like a friend of mine's daughter. So it's important to, I would say, seek out a professional opinion from an OT, seek out a professional opinion from a play therapist, and then for you as a parent, get a parent coach. Because
Right.
really, wherever you are, whoever you're with, I would just encourage you to parent consciously, meaning knowing the why behind your choices, knowing the values that your choices are rooted in, knowing how your attitude and your emotions as a parent can affect your situation, make it better or worse. For my son, just shifting my approach hugely and immensely helped the approach or the dynamic and the patterns in our home. And then, knowing how your child's nervous system and brain function. And, I just encourage you to through whatever it is that you're doing, whatever your approach is, try to keep the most try to keep the most connected relationship with your child that you can, because I think
Right.
that relationship is ultimately everything, whether that's instilling values, shifting behaviors. It's really the relationship that's the foundation that allows you to influence your child for better or for worse.
Right. I love that. And a lot of us don't have a village like we used to. So there's something to be said about finding that help, even if it is finding a parent coach. Sometimes people are like, I'm not going to pay for somebody to help me. Sometimes that's what you need. And there's no shame in saying that. We don't have we don't have the communities like we used to, and having someone else to lean on to help you find the answers. They may not be able to give you answers, but they can help you get going on that journey of finding the answers for yourself. So I love everything that you just said. Well, where can people find you if they want to reach out?
Thank you. My website is the best place, which is unconditionalconnections.com. I don't use social media, and that's on purpose. So that's the only spot you can find me. But I do want to encourage your listeners I actually have a freebie that is going to be shifting here soon. So depending on when this podcast release and what's on my website, you'll either have the opportunity to download my free 5-step guide for setting loving limits without shame or manipulation or punishment, or you'll have the opportunity to take my quiz, which is called Discover the Impact of Your Parenting. So in just 20 questions, 20 yes or no questions, you can discover the impact that your parenting is having on your child, and then some personalized next steps that you can take after that. So yeah, my website will have that as a pop-up that you can find. You can also email me at amanda@unconditionalconnections.com.
I love that. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I absolutely loved this recording. I love everything about what we talked about, and it was so eye-opening. So thank you so much for coming on here.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Remember, you are powerful, you are worthy, you are valued, and you are loved. Keep pushing, keep loving, and most importantly, keep believing in your amazing ability to empower your legacy.